On July 16th, 1969, Armstrong led his crew to the transfer van that would take them to the launch pad. And he looks pretty confident here, but in reality, he had privately concluded that he and his crew had about a 90% chance of making it back to Earth safely, but only a 50% chance of a successful lunar landing. He knew that the landing was the biggest challenge anybody had ever tried in a space flight. It was the most complex portion of the flight, and there were more chances for things to go wrong. So his confidence was tempered by that knowledge. Well, everything in the flight went perfectly right up until July 20th, 1969, when Armstrong and Aldrin got into their spacesuits and checked out their lunar module, and then said goodbye to Mike Collins in the command module Columbia. Armstrong and Aldrin now inside the lunar module Eagle. They separated, and this is what Eagle looked like as Collins photographed it as Eagle began to pull away. And you can see at the bottom of the landing legs, 3 of the landing legs have sort of wire-like projections coming down from them. Those are the contact probes, the lunar contact probes that would signal when Armstrong and Aldrin had actually touched the moon, when Eagle had touched the moon, and that was the time for them to turn off the engine and settle down onto the surface. But of course, a lot of things had to happen before then. And there were problems almost as soon as the final descent to the moon began. Remember, they went down to 50,000 feet and reignited their descent engine just as according to plan, but right away there were problems. There was communications trouble. Then there were problems with the onboard computer. The computer was becoming overloaded with things to do and threatened to give up the mission. Fortunately, there were experts in mission control who figured it out and told the astronauts they could keep going. Well, at that point, they were only about 1,000 feet or so above the moon, and Armstrong finally had a chance to look out the window. Because of all the computer alarms, he'd been distracted and had not had a chance to survey the region where they were going. Now he looked out, and this is an illustration by John Knoll of what he saw through the window. There you see that grid, that landing point designator grid, and the computer is telling him that they are heading right for that big crater that you see. It's the size of a football stadium, and those big boulders are the size of small cars. Well, this is definitely not the place to try and land. And so you see Armstrong's hand down at the bottom there, reaching for the switch that will give him semi-manual control and to take over and hunt for a safe spot. Well, that really started to get tense. Of course, he knew they were getting low on fuel, and the last few moments of the descent were truly a cliffhanger. Let's take a look at an animation that John Knoll did showing those last few moments. You can see the LEM is coming down. There's the thrust from its big engine. It's balanced on that rocket exhaust as it comes down. And Armstrong is trying to avoid coming down too quickly or too slowly. Now the dust on the ground is starting to blow because of the exhaust from the rocket. And that's causing problems. It's obscuring his view of the surface. And he also knows that that fuel supply is dwindling. He's trying not to drift in the wrong direction as he comes down. You're drifting a little bit. There are the contact probes. And now they're down. Control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. Famous words now.
We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
What an incredible historic moment. And then, of course, 7 hours later, a moment that is indelibly burned into anybody who witnessed it. When Armstrong and Aldrin got into their spacesuits and opened the hatch, Armstrong came down the ladder and took humanity's first footsteps on another world. Here he is in a frame from the onboard motion picture film He's just completed gathering that first sample of rocks and dust called the contingency sample, and the collector from the sample is at his feet, and he's put the bag of moon dust and rock in his pocket, and you can actually see his face through his visor. They had these gold sun visors that were usually lowered, but for this one frame at least, you can see him clearly through the clear portion of the visor. Well, the one thing that nobody had predicted, all the science fiction writing that had been done about humans landing on the moon, they'd never predicted that there might be live television of the event. But here it is. Let's take a look at Armstrong and Aldrin, who is now on the surface with him, as Armstrong reads the commemorative plaque on the front of the LEM.
For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this LEM. There's two hemispheres, one showing each of the two hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Two men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD." It came in peace.
And then the television progressed through the moonwalk. We watched them unfurling the American flag and planting it on the surface. They took a phone call from Richard Nixon. They gathered rock samples. They put out their rudimentary experiments. There was a seismometer to measure any moonquakes. There was a reflector to let scientists on Earth bounce a laser beam off the moon and receive it back on Earth to accurately measure the moon's distance. And then after only a couple of hours, they got back in the lunar module. They repressurized the cabin. They tried to get a night's sleep. That turned out to be harder than expected. It wasn't that comfortable. The cabin was colder than they liked. But then the next day, it was time for the real moment of truth, which was the takeoff from the moon. And of course, no one was more nervous about that than Mike Collins, who had been waiting in lunar orbit by himself, hoping against hope that that engine would work. When the moment came, it did indeed fire. Here's a painting of that moment that was done by Apollo astronaut and moonwalker Alan Bean, who became an artist after he left NASA. And of course, there's no photographs of the event, but Bean's painting shows that spray of gold foil as the lunar module ascent engine ignited and carried Armstrong and Aldrin back to a rendezvous with Collins. And from that point on, it was all just beautiful. On July 24th, 1969, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins splashed down in the Pacific. And at that moment, as you can see on the left, the astronauts are sitting in their life raft wearing special biological isolation garments. This was because that there were many people in the world who were afraid that the moon might have some kind of deadly germ on it. And so just for mostly political reasons, NASA agreed that the astronauts would put on these biological isolation garments as they landed, and they would spend a couple of weeks in quarantine before we let them out into the world. Of course, there were no germs. And on the right, you can see at the time of splashdown, some of the people who had worked so hard to make this a reality, celebrating in Mission Control, waving flags, and the sign on the front of Mission Control says, "Task accomplished, July 1969." And a few days later, the treasure from Apollo 11 arrived at the Space Center, the first rocks from the moon. The moon was now a world that we could explore directly and start to unlock its secrets. And Kennedy's challenge had been accomplished, and it was truly a moment for the ages. I'm Andy Chaikin. We'll see you next week.